This is the Life and Times interview of Mr. Dennis Young. Okay, so we'll start with the childhood memories. Tell me about the trip taking cabbages to Auntie Doris on the tram. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was embarrassing for me. I was only a small boy, I don't know, about 6 or 7, and Dad had quite a nice garden with a lot of cabbages in, so my mother cut a couple of them and put them in a paper bag. We didn't have plastic bags in those days, and gave me a penny and said, take it, or she gave me tuppence so I could come home again, said, take this to Auntie Doris. So I got on the tram car and went up there, and when I gave Auntie Doris this, she looked in the bag and then she cried. And I couldn't work out why she was crying at that stage, but I realised afterwards my uncle, that's Uncle Harry, he was out of work and they just had nothing to eat in the house, no money to buy anything, and they had 3 hungry boys to feed as well.
Can you tell me anything else about this?
Yes, there was lots of people like that at the time, and there was some work that they called relief work was available for some people, but usually that meant that Dad had to go and work up in the bush somewhere, or go and make a road and out in the countryside. And you know, who was going to look after the mother and the children when he's away from home? So it was pretty difficult times. That's what they called the Depression, and people that lived through that talked about it for the rest of their lives.
Okay. Would you like to tell me about the Italian families and the sons going to war?
Yes. Yeah, we had lots of Italian people in Island Bay. They were Catholics mostly, and had grouped together there because they came from the parts of Italy where the main work for the men was fishing, and they had motor launches sheltered by the island in Island Bay, and they could quickly get out to Cook Strait and fish for the markets. So that was their trade, or their profession, was fishing. There were a few Shetland Islanders, but nearly all of them were Italians. And then when war came, and the war was originally with the Germans, and then when the Italians thought the Germans were winning, they joined in on the German side. And so the government decided that everyone who was Italian, as well as everyone that was German who lived in New Zealand, should be interned. That's put into a sort of a prison, and they used Soames Island out in Wellington Harbour for that. And although they were there and locked up as being what they called enemy aliens, the sons were being called up into the army and sent off to the deserts in Egypt and North Africa, and there they were fighting the Italian army. It's silly, isn't it? And then after all that, they found all these fishing boats were sitting in Island Bay, and there was no fish, and food rationing was starting because there were shortages of food as the men were going overseas in the forces. So they had to let these fellows off Soames Island again so they could go back and fish. And then one of the first things I remember after that was that New Zealand had a few old bombers that were made out of rag and wood and bits of string, or that's what they looked like anyway. And they were flying around towing targets for the anti-aircraft gunners to shoot at for practice. And one of them crashed, and who towed them in but the Italian fishermen? The people that had been interned as being aliens. And New Zealand had those old aeroplanes that they'd had since, I don't know, 1920 or something, because we'd bought something like 60 Wellington bombers, but when war broke out, the New Zealand government generously donated them straight to the British government, and they formed the beginning of the New Zealand Air Force squadron that was based in Britain during the war.
Okay. Tell me about the uniforms and the marches at school.
Oh, at school, yeah, the school cadets, they called that. I think it did go on before the war, but they had Army World War One dress jackets for the troops, which were khaki and had brass buttons that we had to polish. And we had khaki short trousers with a fancy belt, a bit like a scout belt with a snake on the front. And we had the Glengarry type of what they called the field service cap that the Army were using. And we had khaki socks up to the knees, stockings they called them, but they had no feet in them. They just had a strap under the foot so that you didn't wear holes in the Army's equipment. And so there was about 800 of us at Wellington College, and we formed a battalion, and we learned about organising armies into battalions and companies and platoons and squads and such like things. And they gave us World War One rifles, and we marched around with those as well. And I quite enjoyed it because it was a half a day every week that we did that. And then occasionally we'd be taken to the rifle range on the property, and we'd learn to shoot, and we were able to use the rifles and Vickers machine guns and mortars, and Army fellows came and showed us what to do and what not to do. So for young lads it was really quite exciting and enjoyable. We didn't see the horrors of war in that.
How old were you?
Well, when I started I was 13, and when I finished I was 16 or 17, something like that.
Okay. Tell me about boys delivering telegrams with bad news.
Yes, that was quite scary for people, because lots of men from New Zealand families and some women too, mostly as nurses and so on, were away. Most of them were in the forces in the Middle East, that's Egypt and Libya and those places in North Africa, and later on, of course, as the war progressed, over in Italy and working up into Europe. But a lot were at sea in both the Royal New Zealand Navy and the Royal Navy, and a lot were in the Air Force, both in the Pacific and in the European part of the war. And of course the way that people were told when their men had gone missing, or if they'd been killed or were missing, believed to be prisoners of war or something, would be a telegram. Not many people had telephones then, and so a boy would come from the post office on a bicycle, and often the woman would be scared to open the door and see the telegram. But we had one of my aunties living with us, one of my mother's sisters, half-sisters, and her husband was in the Army. He was actually attached to the Maori battalion, although he wasn't a Maori, but he was a radio operator, and so he had that special skill that they didn't have enough Maori operators for. And one Christmas Eve, a boy came up the path. We lived at the top of a great big steep hill in Island Bay, and a hot day in the summer, and this boy came up on his bike with his post office uniform on and his little bag with his telegram, and came up to the door, and the whole family was scared to open the door almost, but we got the telegram, and it was just a Christmas greeting. Where someone had forgotten to send us a Christmas card, so they sent us what they called a greetings telegram. It was printed on a special bit of paper with a bit of holly printed around to make a pattern. So that boy was received well. He was given some of my mother's homemade lemonade, and strangely enough he liked it a lot, and he had 2 or 3 glasses, and it proved she had brewed it too long, and it caused quite a lot of alcohol to appear in it, because he went away weaving down the road and singing at the top of his voice.
Tell me about the school holidays and packing Red Cross parcels.
Oh yes, under the Geneva Agreement, I think it's called, countries which have taken enemy troops as prisoners have got to keep them and look after them, but they tended to be short of a lot of things, both food and comforts. so the International Red Cross organised for people from the home country to do up parcels which they arranged to be delivered. Of course, they weren't allowed to have anything personal information or notes or anything in, but we'd pack these things up with bars of chocolate and some warm socks and gloves and a balaclava or a scarf or something like that, and a bit of good New Zealand produce, some dried fruits or tinned meats or something like that, and these would be sent off and go to Germany, to the where the troops were being held prisoner, and sometimes they even got them.
Tell me about the polio crisis and the closing of the schools.
Yes, we don't think about polio so much. We used to call it infantile paralysis in those days, but it was a terribly serious disease, and there wasn't really much treatment available, except hopefully to manage to keep the people alive until they could recover a bit. It often left them with paralysed legs, so they could hardly walk or had to have steel calipers on to walk, and sometimes it paralysed the chest muscle so that the person couldn't breathe and suffocated if they couldn't be got into a piece of apparatus they called an iron lung that with the chest while the paralysis existed. And so when this outbreak occurred, and it must have been, can't remember, about 1935, 36, something like that, the schools broke up about the beginning of November and didn't go back again till I think it was May or sometime like that. And it was a long, hot summer, but we weren't allowed to go to the movies and we weren't allowed to go to sports events. So in the little street I lived in, there was about 12 houses, I think, and nearly all of them had school kids. So we made our own fun, and we'd spend our time at the beach at Island Bay, or fishing from the rocks, or looking in the rock pools, and playing around, talking to each other, making forts in the gorse on the hills and so on. And then it was quite a shock to go back to school after about 6 months.
Okay. What else can you remember about that?
Well, no one in our street got infantile paralysis, but the people in school, there were several of them sort of disappeared, and really we didn't see them again because they were sick for so long that they had their schooling in the hospitals where they were. And some of them recovered quite well, but now, whatever it is, 50 years, 60 years later, they're starting to get secondary effects from the paralysis, and it's happening again. Really does show the value of inoculation and vaccination. The first vaccine that they had, they injected, and then they introduced the one that you just take as a little drink and take 2 or 3 times in childhood, or we had them as later on as adults when it was developed. And it's just about eliminated the disease, and really a good thing.
Okay, tell me about the holidays with cousins.
Oh yes, because I think I recorded in the notes I made that I was really an only child until my sister was born, which wasn't until I'd started work. And but we spent quite a lot of time with one of my mother's brothers who lived at Miramar when we lived at Island Bay, and the one son was the same age as me almost, it was Jack, and the other one was a little bit older and considered himself superior because he was the older. But we had a lot of fun together in the holidays and sometimes at weekend visits and so on, and we'd do things together. We used to go to Plymouton. Plymouton's just a suburb of Pororua now, but then it was an exciting train trip away from Wellington in a steam train. And my old dog, or he wasn't old then, that we called Chum because he had a black mark on his white side that looked like the head of another dog, so he always had a chum with him. The chum meant friends in those days. I don't know what it means these days. Probably means something you throw in to attract fish when you're fishing. And so we'd pack up the dog into the guard's van and we'd all go up there for the summer holidays, the school holidays. Our parents, our fathers would go to work on the steam train and we'd stay up there at the beach. That leads to an interesting thought too. My uncle, for part of that time, was a ship's radio operator, so he'd be away sometimes for a good part of the holidays. He'd be at sea. And one time we're up there and we ran out of money. This was the depression we were talking about earlier, I think, or maybe we haven't talked about it yet, I can't remember. It's certainly in the notes. But we were staying there at the little batch, which was a little sort of a hut with no lining, made of corrugated iron, and it had a thing like a garage, and we had bunks in there and a little kitchen. But we ran out of food and we had nothing to eat, so my mother and my aunt decided we had to go home, because at home we had gardens with veggies and so on in. And we were walking around all disconsolate because our holiday was being interrupted, and my mother suddenly bent down and grabbed something off the ground and said, "Oh, let's go back again." We thought, so that's funny, but what Mum says goes, like in your house, I suppose. And so we went back again, and she'd found 10 shillings on the road. And that was enough to keep 2 ladies and 3 hungry boys in plenty of food for the whole of the rest of the week till fathers got out with their pay that they got on Friday. And then they went round with the 10 shillings to the local policeman and handed it in, because they'd found 10 shillings. They were very guilty. They'd kept it and used it for a few days. It wasn't the same 10 shillings, of course. So, yes, thing that I wouldn't like to keep a family on $1 an hour for a week.
Okay, tell me about the Baby Austin car.
Oh yeah, that was good fun. It was a tourer model. That meant it had a canvas hood that could be folded down, though we never seemed to fold it down. I think Dad was scared if he folded it down that it would get stuck and wouldn't get up again. But we used to go lots of places on that. We went to Miramar to visit my Uncle Harold and the cousins and so on over there, and my Auntie Mafenwe, or Auntie Vanis we called her. I remember one time when we were there visiting, someone had siphoned the petrol and most of the petrol out of the tank, and my dad didn't notice. I don't think those old cars had a gauge in them to tell you how much petrol was in the tank anyway. And we were coming home around the coast, and we got to a point south of Island Bay that's called Arthur's Nose. It's called Arthur's Nose because it's supposed to look like the great big nose that the Duke of Wellington had, or Duke of Wellesley or whatever he was Duke of, and his name was Arthur. Anyway, that's wandering. But the Baby Austin ran out of petrol, and there was no service station or shop or anything around there, so we pushed the car around, and there was a good southerly blowing. We held the 2 doors open. It only had 2 doors. And they acted like sails, and we sailed all the way back to Island Bay, and there was a grocery shop open, and we bought a quart bottle of petrol that was lighter fluid or white spirit for a stove, tipped that in the tank, and that got us all the way home to Island Bay with a bit to spare.
Okay, tell me about winter Saturdays at the pictures.
Yeah, the matinees and the serials. Where in the summertime, of course, we spent all our time at the beach on Saturdays if we could, and the school kids were junior members of the Surf Life-Saving Club at Island Bay, and learned a little bit about life-saving and got our bronze medallions. But in the wintertime, we were allowed to go, as long as there was enough money, allowed to go to the cinema, and we'd have, I think it was threepence to get into see the films, and another penny to spend, and we'd go to the little lolly shop next door, and it would take a long time to decide what to buy for a penny, because you could buy several things for 1 penny. That's these days about worth it'd be a half a cent now, and you can't get such small coins. The smallest coin we've got 5 cents, isn't it? So we'd go there, and the first half of the program would be shorts. There'd be a serial, it might be Brick Bradford or Buck Rogers or the Perils of Pauline was another one. They always ended at an exciting place with the hero just in the most dangerous position, so you'd have to go back next week and see what happened. You always got out of it, of course. And then there'd be shorts, there'd be some comedies and some cartoons and the newsreel, because we didn't have TV for TV news, so you had the same sort of news on film, except that it was in much greater detail than you ever see on TV. And then afterwards would be the main feature film, as it was called, and that it would be some film like The Lone Ranger or something that was suitable for old Robin Hood, or some suitable film for kids. And then on Saturday evening and every evening of the week they'd have adults films. So that was it, and we all used to go down there and all used to cheer the hero and boo the villain out loudly, and if we got bored, throw jaffas at each other.
Now let's move on to teenage years. College while the war continues. What would you like to tell me about that?
There was a little overlap there, because we were talking a little while ago about the college cadet side of things, and that was one side where we marched around and played soldiers, though we were really only just little boys still. But then there was the actual schoolwork, which was good. There was quite a lot of older men who were really retired or semi-retired schoolmasters who had come back onto the job because of the war and the younger men being away in the forces. And as well as that, and a real horror to some of those men, was that here at Wellington College, which was a bit like a gentleman's club, and, apart from the matron who looked after the cooking and the illnesses of the boarders at the college, women just weren't expected to be seen anywhere there, really segregated. And these men were a bit upset to find all these, what they looked on as young kids of girls teaching the boys. The boys liked it, mind you, because they're getting into their teens, and some of these teachers were quite young and good-looking women. Boys, like girls, get crushes when they see nice people of the other sex. Well, they did in those days. I'm sure it hasn't changed. But there were other effects that were quite strange. One thing was that they used to employ a couple of old gardeners with scythes to mow the football fields and so on, because they couldn't get enough petrol to run the motor mowers, and they no longer had a horse to pull the horse-drawn mowers that they still had in the old equipment in the equipment shed. So here was these men with these great big scythes with their funny bendy handles and swinging them and making a job just like a mowed lawn out of it. Took longer though. And of course up on Mount Victoria, just above the college, there was anti-aircraft guns. I think most of them were reputed to be Warden imitations to fool any spies that were in the city. But there was a little detachment of army men were sort of, for a while, were based in the college to man these guns, and they'd go up there every day and clean them and do whatever they did with guns when there was no one to shoot at. If they wanted to actually have it practiced, they wheeled them off behind trucks to Island Bay or the coast near Island Bay, and out over the sea, one of these old Baffin bombers would tow a sort of a thing they called a drove, like a sort of windsock behind them, and they'd shoot at or near that to practice their skills. As boys, we used to like to slip down and watch them do it, but my dog was terrified of the bangs. He used to go and hide under the radio set or under the bed or anywhere he could get in the house to get away from it.
Okay. Tell me about starting work.
Oh yes, well, when I was at college, I worked in the holidays quite often. I worked at a clothing factory at one stage, and then I worked in a Boots the Chemist, it was called, in Willis Street, and we were making up cough mixtures and things under the direction of the pharmacist, and sorting stock and cleaning the shop and doing odds and ends of jobs like that and getting some pay. Can't remember what other school jobs I'd got, but then when I left college, I worked a little while for a pharmacist in Newtown, but I decided that I didn't really enjoy working in the shop, so I went and worked at a radio factory called Collier and Beale, and they had just changed over from making the wartime Army radios. The New Zealand radio was called a ZC-1 that the Army used for communications, and they were starting to make mental radios for use in houses, and putting on the mantelpiece by the fireplace. And so I learned to make transformers and to assemble the radios and so on. But I only stayed there a few months before I went to the Land and Income Tax Department, which is now called Inland Revenue Department, or what's the other name, Tari, which is supposed to be Maori, though I don't know quite what it means. It was probably not real Maori at all.
Okay. Tell me what you can recall about joining the Sea Cadet.
Oh, yeah, well, the Sea Cadet actually started that while I was still at college, and this was a sort of a preliminary thing. There was also an air training corps. These were sponsored, well, the Sea Cadets was sponsored jointly by an organisation called the Navy League and the Royal New Zealand Navy, and we were given some naval boats and a base on Petone foreshore, and had naval seamen's uniforms to wear. They managed to find ones that were the right sizes for us, and we trained on theoretical matters in a hall in Taranaki Street, the City Mission Hall, on a Friday night, and then on Saturday we had Navy passes and went on the steam train out to Petone, and we learned to sail the boats and some more drilling Navy style, because the Navy, at least in those days, probably still marched differently from the way the Army does, and we learned to march the Army way at college. And we also had more small arms drill with the old service rifles, and we went to a 22 caliber rifle range, and we had a type of Army rifle that was a standard rifle but had been bored for the small bullets of .22 of an inch instead of .303 of an inch bullets, so it was cheaper to teach us, and they were less powerful to suit the short range, the indoor range. Learned to shoot, and then sometimes at weekends we would be taken to the naval base, which was in Shelley Bay, up Evans Bay, and would have a weekend there of sailing and theoretical and practical tuition from Navy tutors. And for the holiday period, just after Christmas, or just after New Year, usually the day after New Year, up until the end of January, we would go up to HMNZS Tamaki, which is was on Motuhea Island in Auckland Harbour. It was what the Navy call a stone frigate. It was actually buildings and barracks on an island, and we'd get more sailing, and sometimes we'd get attached for a ship. I was attached for a while to HMS Theseus, which was a British naval aircraft carrier, and we did some training around the New Zealand coast, and learned a bit about the aircraft and saw them flying off various aircraft, the Tiger Moth, the captain's little plane, and the Seafires, which were a maritime version of the Spitfire, and Firefly bombers, which were bombers with 2 people manning them and could drop bombs or depth charges or torpedoes. And they had a thing called a Sea Otter, which was a little flying boat or amphibious type flying boat that could land on the deck or in the water. And so we learned about these and getting them started and how to clean them without poking holes in them and so on. So it was all interesting stuff for a young boy.
Okay. What can you recall about VE Day and VJ Day?
Yes, they were big celebrations, of course, because VE Day was the day they called when the Germany capitulated, and Italy had already not only capitulated but changed sides. We used to say that the Italians only went with the winners, and but the VE Day was the day of victory in Europe, where the Germans capitulated and started negotiating an actual peace treaty. And it was announced there was going to be a big city civic celebration at the base and reserve. So my dad thought, well, that'd be a real historic occasion he ought to take me to. And I was in my teens, and just quietly, I think he hoped he might get a free beer when he went there. But when we got there, it was a beautiful day, luckily, but we stood there and listened to the mayor and other dignitaries make boring speeches, and a few bishops and people lead prayers, which really didn't seem a great celebration to us in those days. But VJ Day, which really signalled the end of the war, which is victory in Japan, the end of war in the Pacific part of the war, that really was hastened from what it might have been by the Americans dropping the first atomic bombs that had been used in earnest on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 cities in Japan which really were utterly destroyed. And at that time it seemed great because we thought of all the lives that were going to be saved by suddenly shortening the war, and it maybe was true, but later when we realised the dreadful damage it did, it wasn't so funny after all. But that was a real celebration. It rained, proper Wellington Day. It was wet and it was windy, and everyone was having a wonderful time, and never mind the rain. And, everyone emptied out of their business places and they locked the doors, and the pubs were full, and there were citizens and small boys and big boys and middle-sized boys and girls, and everyone was on the streets of Wellington. Army and Navy and a lot of American servicemen were based here at that stage, Marines and Army and naval ships. Everyone was out having a wonderful time, and that was a celebration. And the one silly little personal remembrance that I've got in there was there was a soldier was desperate to ring his girlfriend, and you needed 2 pennies, I think it was, in those days to work the public telephones. Hadn't thought up ways of using swipe cards for it the way they do now. And so he asked me if I had change for 6pence or a shilling, and I actually did. I think I had 6 pennies, but he was quite impatient when I made him stand while I found the whole 6 pennies in my pocket and gave it to him. He was happy with 2 for his 6pence. If I'd been quicker, I would have made a profit.
Okay, let's move on to young adult years. Tell me about working at the Land and Income Tax Department, now known as the IRD.
Yes, well, the IRD's been in the news just recently, not very well, but we had a completely different attitude to the job in those days, and it was really like a big family. And although there were a lot of workers spread through a few parts of New Zealand. I went there when I thought I wanted something that might be a bit better than working in the radio factory, and one of my uncles was an accountant working there and said, why don't you try here for a while? And really in those days, if you could breathe and if someone could hunt around and find you actually had a pulse to show your heart was beating, you could get a job anywhere you wanted. You just walked in and said, I need a job please, or I want a job. And, all right. Didn't ask you what you could do or what your qualifications were or anything. And so I went in there and started as what they called a cadet. For the day, I was told I was well paid, although it didn't go far. I got paid fortnightly, and I got exactly a £5 note. They weren't supposed to give you a £5 note because it was too hard to change. People would ask you for identification or something to change a £5 note. But so being at the end of the alphabet, they'd get down to counting all the money and find I only had a whole £5 note instead of some single pounds and a couple of 10-shilling notes to pay me. And seeing it used to cost tuppence on the tram from where I worked down to the railway station. That day I usually had to walk down to the railway station, get to the train to Johnsonville where we lived then. But it was a good job, as you probably find out. I stayed there for 40-odd years, 42 years nearly, or except a couple of months. And we had sports there, and I met folk there that I was found very congenial, and we shared a lot of our spare time together as well as working together.
Okay. What can you recall about meeting and becoming engaged to Colleen?
Yes, Colleen was one of my life tragedies in a way. I suppose in the end, fate or God or whatever your beliefs are, for me it's God does rule in our lives. And Colleen was a girl who had come down from Westport or Greymouth, I've forgotten now, on the west coast of the South Island for a job in Wellington. And we had a fellow staying at home, his name was Pat Macleod, who worked for the railways, and he was boarding at our place for a while until he got permanent accommodation. He'd just been transferred to Wellington. He met this girl somewhere and bought a home one time, and I thought she was nice, and she must have thought I was nice because we spent a bit of time together, and eventually after some months we decided we wanted to get married, and we were making plans, but she was unwell and went to the doctor and was found to have TB, tuberculosis as it's called, which was a really dreaded disease in those days and not easily treatable, and the treatments they had were drastic. And when she found she wasn't going to get better for a long time, she wanted to break the engagement and didn't continue, and in fact she eventually died from the disease. So I guess that's one of the things that happens in life. I've still got the engagement ring. In fact, I gave it to Chrissy, and you'll find who Chrissy is later when we talk about it some more, with some other jewellery I had at home, and for her to get it cleaned up, and thought it would make quite a pretty dress ring for one of the younger folk in the family sometime.
Okay. Tell me about marrying Meg.
Yeah, well, Meg was one of these people that were called assisted immigrants. New Zealand history has seen lots of waves of people coming in from different countries, and about the end of the war there was a lot of people called displaced people came to New Zealand. These were mostly Polish and other Europeans, and quite a lot of Dutch people. In fact, when we lived in Wainui Days, it seemed that about half the population was Dutch or Scotch, and the other half was Maori for quite a while. But these folk went to a thing called a transit camp out at Miramar and learned about English and were absorbed into New Zealand life, and a lot of them worked in places, government places, because they needed everyone they could get, but also with other employers. And then these assistant immigrants who were British people who wanted to immigrate started coming out to New Zealand, and Meg, or Margaret Byrne-Jones, came and worked in Inland Revenue, and she came to New Zealand because her sister Jenny had married a New Zealand Fleet Air Arm navigator who was called Tom Marshall, and she had met at an Air Force, or rather a Naval Air Arm base, Fleet Air Arm base in Arbroath in Scotland, and they'd eventually decided to get married, which is a big story in itself and an interesting one. But Meg came out, and so did her other sister Daphne, and her mother. Her father had died, but through Inland Revenue we got to know each other slightly, and then at an Inland Revenue Department picnic, which was an annual function that we used to have at Days Bay in Wellington, over at Eastbourne, I spent most of the day with her and then got to know her better, and eventually we found we were compatible and we got married, and started a completely new and very different life for me, because I was an only child until I was working, and then my sister Kerry was born. She was adopted by my mother, and I was already working, so she was a baby, so I never really knew her as a companion type sister that I could have fights with, and so on the way you probably have fights with your brothers. And he was a much bigger family that was growing year by year as well. A different life.
Okay, what can you recall about sailing?
Well, sailing has been a lifetime interest. I used to go boating as a small school boy in Island Bay, and we'd row in a dinghy first, and then we learned, actually before we had a dinghy, we used to find old corrugated iron on the tip and find some tar at the edges of the road and to block up the nail holes, and sort of bend it into a rough canoe shape and nail each end to a bit of stick and make a paddle out of another stick, and we'd paddle around in the shallow water at the beach. And then I was very friendly with one of the sons of the Shetland Island fishermen, and he had his own little dinghy that his father had given him that was about a 10-footer, and we learned to row in that, and rowed out to the island and had picnics on the island and so on. And then we graduated to little yachts, the Taurons, I think they call them, P-class yachts, little 7-footers, and learned a bit. And then, of course, there was the sea cadet training. But then when I joined Inland Revenue, I met a fellow called Keith Livingston, and his family had a 40-foot ketch, a keel yacht called the Raukawa. And when he found I could sail a bit, he asked me if I'd like to join the crew, and we sailed that. We used to sail over every weekend, or if we weren't sailing, we'd be working on the boat doing maintenance, or have it up on the slip painting it, or we'd be... Do you know the book Wind in the Willows? It's a good one, and there's a character called Ratty in there that says there's nothing on earth that's as worth doing as just mucking around in boats. And that's how I was. So we used to sail. I suppose my best achievement there was that we sailed the yacht in the Cook Strait race they used to have every year on Christmas Eve, and came second in the race from Wellington to Picton, and then spent our holidays sailing in the Marlborough Sounds. And after Keith's father died, and he had to, the estate had to sell the yacht, but we got the use of a very old class of yacht. Her name was Yvonne, and she was what they called a plank on edge because they were very narrow and for their length, and they used to tend to sail through the waves rather than up and over them, which was a bit faster than going up and over them, but very wet when you were sailing. And we sailed centreboard yachts and anything else we could get. Then I was away for that for a long time.
Okay. What can you recall about basketball for the Texas team?
Oh yes, well, the tax departments tended to look to each other, or the workers in the tax department did, you know, when you went out somewhere, like when I joined the rifle club, the small bore shooting club at Kandala, near where I lived in Johnsonville. You know, when they asked me where I worked, and I said in the income tax department, I thought for a while they were going to practice there by using me as a target. You weren't allowed to speak about what you knew of other people's affairs outside the office, so I had to, you couldn't let anything slip, so you took your social time with your workmates as well. And one of the things we did was we had quite strong sports teams. We had a cricket team in the Mercantile League of Cricket, and we had basketball. Basketball wasn't a widely known sport in New Zealand at that time, but it was a very popular sport in America. And mostly I didn't like competitive ball games and things. We were chasing around after a ball on the paddock. I preferred to go sailing, but I did enjoy playing basketball. And so we had a national tournament of Texas teams from all over the country in different towns, and used to play in those. And the only achievement that was worth remembering was that I was in a team, a Wellington area team, that was chosen to play against the Latter-day Saints, which was an American team. I think there's now a descendant of that team just called the Saints play in Wellington still. But now they've grown their men to be all over 6 feet tall. But in those days, 6 feet was amongst the tallest that played. And so that was good. And one of my most embarrassing moments came in another tournament in Masterton, when I got myself in a perfect position under the basket, got the ball passed to me, and then slipped when I went to shoot and dropped it over the line. And, there were a lot of jeers from the audience watching. And I got banished to the back of the team instead of in the forwards.
Okay, let's move on to your middle years. Tell me about your extended family activities.
Yes, well, after being a sort of a solitary child a lot of my life, and then a little bit of a loner later when I'd started work, although I had a lot of friends both from sailing and basketball and work, suddenly there was the more intimate relationship, because Meegan, Jenny and Daphne, the three Burne-Jones girls, nearly all of their adult lives lived within, I was going to say within Kui, they were just about within touching distance of each other, and much of the time, if we weren't next door, we were in the next block sort of thing. And of course there were children coming along, and although Meg and I didn't have any children of our own, the nieces and nephews made quite good surrogate family, and we enjoyed having them come around, and they seemed to like coming around, especially the boys liked bringing broken toys around for me to fix. And Don, Robert's father, was quite good at odd jobs like that, but Tom was absolutely hopeless. Most of the things he fixed fell apart. But we did things very much together as a family. We took outings together. We later on went to church together. We certainly took holidays together at the beach. sometimes Meegan and I couldn't be there the whole time because we couldn't always get our holidays at the appropriate time. But it was a very favourite way to have a holiday, was to come and rent a house or a cottage or something at Parabram Beach or Raumati, somewhere around there, and we did never like getting far away from the sea. We'd spend time at the beach and time fishing and time just doing things that you do on holiday, playing Scrabble at night or card games, which didn't much interest me, so I'd often have some radio gear to muck around with. But it was quite an interesting relationship, which did last for about 30 years, I would say.
Okay, tell me about becoming a Christian.
Yeah, that was, well, to me it's an interesting story, because when I was a kid, the only times I ever went to any sort of religious thing was when parents of my friends got married, or their children got baptised, or older people got buried after dying. Or I sometimes went to the beach Sunday school that they ran on Island Bay Beach on a summer's day. I'd have a swim, and then towards the end of the Sunday school lesson I would slip along to and join in with the kids at the Sunday school class, because they gave away a free cake of chocolate to each kid at the end. Then, oh dear, I suppose I might have been about 25 or something, and my mother was very ill, and of course Tom and Jenny particularly, and Daphne to a smaller extent, kept making sure I knew there were some advantages in Christianity, and I'm sure kept praying for me. And when my mother was very ill, there was a Catholic lady that worked with me, gave up several lunchtimes, I think for a whole week, and went up to St Mary of the Angels Catholic Church in Bulcott Street in Wellington, not far from where we worked, but instead of having her lunch, she went up and prayed for my mother, and my mother unexpectedly got quite well again, and in fact lived for quite a while after that. And so this got me a little bit interested, not a big bit interested, but a little bit interested. But rather reluctantly, Meg and I allowed ourselves to be taken to hear a preacher called Billy Graham, who was touring New Zealand, the first sort of big evangelical Christian visits that had been, I think, since before the war. And there was a big gathering at Athletic Park. Everything seemed to go wrong. The bus was late, and we had trouble getting in because of all of Wellington. There seemed to be more people there than at a big rugby match. And he preached on John 3:16, which stuck in my mind, which said, whoever believes on the Lord will be saved, and whoever seemed to be me at that time. But anyway, I thought, well, that's interesting, great preacher, what are all those people going to the front for? And we went home, but I did agree as a follow-up to that to go along to the Baptist church where the minister was a man called David Comber, I think. Pretty sure that was, no, Donald Comber, that was his name. And learned a little bit about Christian belief and about baptism, and then one evening Dawn and I had gone to bed and were sitting up in bed and decided we should pray, and I decided I should be baptised. And really my real conversion came at the time of the baptism, and since then I've found the Christian path the only one worth following. Later on, Donald had a similar experience without going to Billy Graham. I've forgotten, I think it was Tom Marshall might have been preaching at the Baptist church, and Don was moved and he went home, and we'd gone on to a prayer meeting or something afterwards, and he phoned up in tears and said he had also made the decision the Christian way was for him, that Jesus was a real person after all. So it was encouraging for me to see that sort of the last adult member of the family had decided on the Christian way.
Okay, tell me about your brush with several disasters.
Now, these would probably be the assorted national disasters, the three big ones that stick in my mind. The first one was one Christmas Eve, 1953 I think it was, and we were listening to the radio and heard that the Express, or the Limited Express, one of the trains from Wellington to Auckland, had actually run off a bridge that had been washed away by mud and river from Mount Ruapehu, washing down the river and washing away the bridge at a place called Tangiwai. And the locomotive and the first few carriages had dived into the water, and a lot of people were killed. One of the fellows that I worked with was on the train, and he was in a carriage that stopped suddenly and sort of was tilting down as if they had started down a steep hill, and he wondered why the train had stopped, and he opened the door and saw his carriage was hanging out over the muddy water that was rushing by in the flood. And that really affected almost everyone in New Zealand. Being Christmas Eve, the train was full of family, people going home, taking the presents to have Christmas at home and so on. And I think the next big one was what is usually called the Erebus disaster, where Air New Zealand ran an aeroplane down to Antarctica, just a sightseeing trip. And one of my radio operator friends had saved up his money for his holidays to take that one-day trip down to see that, and was on the plane. And they got something wrong with the navigation and flew smack into the side of that volcano in Antarctica. It was called Mount Erebus. Of course, everyone was killed. I think, can't remember how many, was it about 50 or 60 people, not as big as the jumbo jets of today, but enough so that it affected people throughout New Zealand, and there was inquiries and so on, and very hard words said about the way the causes of the accident. They'd tried to be covered up by the officials, and the sitting judge, Justice Mann, I think he was called, he referred to the evidence that had been given by the official people as a litany of lies. Then the last one, which you keep seeing repeated on TV news quite often, was when the Wahine, the ferry between the South and North Island, was coming up, and that was just at Easter time. Funny how these things happen on holidays. And it was coming up from the South Island and ran onto Barrett's Reef at the entrance to Wellington Harbour in bad visibility, and then bounced off that and sank and rolled over just off Seaturn in the entrance to the harbour, so that there was quite a number 50-something, 53 I think it was, killed, and many people rescued. Huge seas and some dramatic work done by rescuers, both on the rocks, on the beaches, on both sides of the channel, and by the rescue helicopter. There's a famous photo of that going between the waves, and all you can see sticking up from between the waves was so high, was just the tail rotor of the helicopter. And that was that pilot, Peter Button, that was killed in what should have been only a little accident, but his helicopter crashed and caused it to be a bad accident a few years later.
Okay. What can you recall about building the Takati?
Yes, the Takati. I think I said before when we were talking about sailing, I was away from boating and yachting for quite a few years, I made a little dinghy that I called Putzi, that we had, was only about 6.5 feet long. We had lots of fun with that down on the Wainui River and at the beaches and so on. Sometimes brought it up to the Kapiti coast and had it up here. Later on, earlier, we had borrowed a boat a couple of times for fishing at the beach. And I'd also made a sailboard, which was really the forerunner of today's surf sailors, but it wasn't nearly so dramatic as a surf sailor. But I decided I would like to build something a bit bigger that we could share in, with the whole family sharing in. So I got what they call a table of offsets and information about this 22-foot launch which I called Takati, and there was a cabin cruiser, and I built that on the lawn at Wainui and was constructed upside down. A lot of people asked me if I was building a garden shed until it took shape. So it was a lot of fun building that, and all the family turned out, and other friends turned out to help me turn it the right way up when it was partly constructed, and helped me with painting and doing various jobs on it. And then we took it over the hill on a big truck. A big crane came and lifted it into water, and we went over to near the mouth of the Hutt River, and the crane lowered it into the water, and the motor started, and we motored off up and moored it in the river for the first little while till I got proper moorings. And we had lots and lots of real good holidays on that, with the three sisters and the husbands and the children, and we went fishing and we went picnicking, and it was just a good time of our lives at that stage.
Okay. Tell me about becoming a licensed amateur radio operator.
I'd always been a bit interested in radio, and I mentioned earlier that I worked for a little while in a radio factory, but didn't learn a lot about radio. But then at a sale there was a bargain with some things called transistors and a few bits and pieces in it that I took home and found I could make into radios and all sorts of things, and I could listen to shortwave. And one of my uncles, Harold, that I mentioned before, that we used to go holidays with when I was a kid, he used to be a radio operator at sea, and then after the war he got an amateur radio license, and he had one of those army radios that I mentioned, a ZC1 that they made at that factory I worked at, and used to talk to people, voice and Morse all around the world, and I found that fascinating. So that playing with those transistors reminded me, and so I started having a look through some instruction manuals and decided I might be able to answer enough questions to pass the radio exam. So I went to Lower Hutt Amateur Radios club rooms, and they had some classes for beginners, and I joined up with that class and found I really knew most of what they were teaching, partly from the study I'd done then, and partly from my college days when science was one of my favourite subjects, and electricity and magnetism, they called it then, they call it physics now, was part of that course. And so I went and did the exam and passed it with no trouble. But then to really get the full use out of the amateur license, I needed Morse code. And my brother-in-law, Rob Macleod, had been a radio operator, air gunner in the Lancaster bombers during the war, and he could remember the code no trouble. He was a very good radio Morse operator. So he taught me Morse code in the space of a few months, and I managed to pass the Morse. And then I taught him the theory, and he managed to pass the theory, so he got a ham ticket too. And then that's been really an abiding interest. And right from early in my experience as radio amateur operator, I have had other people come to me to get tuition. I've run classes first at home in Wainui Days to save people there from having to travel over the hill to Lower Hutt, and more recently up here on the Kapiti coast, and still doing that, still enjoying it, and still getting great satisfaction when the people who come through the class go and pass their exam. It's almost as exciting as when I passed myself in the first place.